perhaps your child been trying to learn Spanish for quite some time now, and you just can't seem to get to that next level of actually being able to speak the language with fluency? What could be the problem? Well, today we're going to talk about 10 reasons why many never actually get to that next level. I've been teaching Spanish for some 10 plus years now, and these are 10 things that I have seen as common amongst those who never really progress to being able to speak Spanish with fluency. So there's actually an article on the Spanish Sports and Spice blog website, and we will find this article and talk a little bit about these 10 reasons. So the article here is entitled 10 Reasons You or Your Kids Still Can't Speak Spanish. And we're going to get right into it. The number one reason you still can't conjugate verbs. I can't tell you how many people I have seen that have been learning Spanish, taking classes, a lot of different methods for years, and they still struggle to conjugate verbs. It boggles my mind. I think it comes down to the fact that in English, conjugating verbs is generally easier. You have a word like eat, to eat. And when we conjugate that, I eat, you eat, he eats, we eat, and they eat. Really, that word eat stays the same for each of those conjugations. It's always just eat, except for he or she. In English, you add an S, and it becomes eats. But really, all the other ones are the same. There's just one change you have to remember when you're learning English as far as conjugating verbs, that you have to add an S to the he or the she. But in Spanish, each one of those changes. For example, comer, to eat, ends in ER. But it's yo como, I eat, tú comes. Él come, nosotros comemos, ellos comen. So we see each and every time there's a change. And sometimes for English speakers trying to learn Spanish, perhaps they just don't really want to spend all that time in the beginning trying to memorize those verb conjugations. But if you can't conjugate verbs, you can't form your own sentences correctly, and you never can really get on that road of being able to converse in an easily understood way because you can't conjugate verbs. You could literally be like many of these people that I've met, that I know, that have been trying to learn Spanish for years. And sure, they sort of get across their point, but anybody listening to them who speaks Spanish, it like hurts the ears. And a lot of times it's just not understood because they still can't conjugate the verbs and put the correct ending. So that's the number one reason. Definitely have to, in the beginning, dedicate that time to memorizing the verb conjugations in all the necessary tenses. The present tense is just one. The second reason that many people never progress to that next level of actually being able to speak Spanish is they don't know the subjunctive tense. Some people don't even know what that is, let alone actually being able to do it. The subjunctive tense is perhaps half of all Spanish, as the article mentions, and it's so important to the language and to the culture that it's a mood that spans multiple tenses. In fact, it's probably most correct to call it the subjunctive mood. And this has to do with basically when somebody wants or doesn't want somebody else to do something. The mood of many things that we say are just facts. Maybe what I want to do or what is happening. And that includes all the basic tenses that you learn in the beginning. and that entire mood is called the indicative mood. Facts, what somebody themselves, what they maybe want to do. And if I want to do something, most likely I'm going to do it. There's not a whole lot of doubt or uncertainty involved in the indicative mood, but the subjunctive mood involves a bit of uncertainty, doubt. A lot of times, what comes into play is what somebody wants somebody else to do. If you want somebody else to do it, it's not so certain that that's going to happen because we can't make people do things. And there's an entirely different way of conjugating the verbs in the subjunctive tense. There's a subjunctive present tense, there's a subjunctive past tense, and being able to understand why it exists, it allows for you to say a lot of different things about what you want somebody else to do in a subtle way, sort of like a euphemism, not so direct, not so offensive. There's a whole tense for that. And it has a lot to do with the Spanish culture and why oftentimes in Spanish language and the Spanish culture, the way they speak, the way we speak is not so offensive in comparison to the English language. And so this is very important. And if we can't do the subjunctive tense, there's no way that we can speak in a fluent way that's easily understood and not riddled with a bunch of errors. So that's usually the second reason why people never get to that next level. Maybe they've been learning Spanish for years and they still aren't even close to being able to do the subjunctive tense, the subjunctive mood correctly. The third reason why you still really can't speak Spanish could be that you still don't understand object pronouns. We're talking about le versus lo. In English, we could have two sentences like, I know him, I teach him. And we're talking about that word him in both sentences. In English, that's the same word, him in both of the sentences. But in Spanish, in one of those sentences, we have to use le, and in the other sentence, we have to use lo. And most people who have been learning Spanish and can't speak it correctly or speak it well in a fluent way still don't know what the difference between le and lo is. And one of the reasons is because that's a hard concept in English, trying to understand what the difference between a direct and an indirect object is. When that is taught or I need to teach that to somebody, we have to spend some time talking about English and what's the difference between a direct and an indirect object. That can be difficult in one's own language, being able to understand that. And so a good teacher needs to be able to explain that well in English, have a good method of teaching that in English in order for someone to understand that in Spanish. The fourth reason that you still may not be able to speak Spanish very well, you still don't understand the difference between the preterite and imperfect. In the past tense in Spanish, there are two main kinds of past tense, the preterite and the imperfect. The preterite is probably the one you most likely think about when you think of examples in the past tense. It's the most basic, simple past tense. And the imperfect is probably something like in English. When I was a kid, I used to go to the park. Or when I was a kid, I would always go to the park. Those ideas of used to or would always in the past. And in English, it's probably a lot easier. A lot of times you just use used to or would, or a lot of times it's just that there's no difference at all in English between how we say a preterite idea in Spanish and an imperfect idea in Spanish. In Spanish, though, there are two different tenses with different conjugational patterns, and it can be really difficult for a native English speaker to learn in every instance why we need to use the simple past and then why we need to use the imperfect. That's something that absolutely can't be skipped over. If you want to be able to speak Spanish well, you have to really have a good understanding in your mind about the difference between the preterite and the imperfect. And a lot of teachers teach it in a way that's just not completely true. Really, the imperfect past tense has to do with the present tense, understanding what the present tense is. When I say, I eat cookies, the present tense, I eat cookies. Nothing's actually happening there when I say I eat cookies. If I say I am eating cookies, the present progressive ing tense, something's happening. I'm literally eating at this moment, or I ate cookies yesterday. Simple past tense, something happened. I'm going to eat cookies tomorrow, something's going to happen. Those are all events. But when we say I eat cookies, the regular present tense, nothing's actually happening. It's just a general truth. And that has a lot to do with understanding the imperfect past tense. It's very interesting. And if we can't get this, we don't get this, we are not going to be able to speak Spanish fluently in a way that's not riddled with errors. The fifth reason why you still can't speak Spanish, your teacher isn't good. And that's been alluded to a lot already during this video. There's a lot of different ways people try to explain the difference between ser and estar, where they say it's temporary and permanent, but that's not really it. Or, as we just mentioned, explaining what the imperfect past tense is. And those explanations just aren't all that correct. Or a lot of times you have these teachers who focus on, as the article mentions, vocabulary, repeating rehearsed conversations. And people spend months using a certain app or a certain teaching method, a program, and they still can't form their own sentences. Mainly because the teaching methods don't focus on memorizing those verb conjugations and being able to use them in an actual sentence. Another error that a lot of teaching methods have is they give a bunch of laws, as the article mentions, for this is when you use estar, all these different reasons. This is when you use ser, all these different reasons. Or the subjunctive tense. You use it in this case, this case, this case, this case, 8 different reasons. And it's not like they're wrong what they're saying, but if a teacher really understands the difference between ser and estar and really understands the point, the culture of the subjunctive tense, you can explain that in like 1, 2, or 3 principles. You don't have to have 9 or 10 different laws. And being able to explain just a few principles and the student only has to remember a couple ideas, it's a lot easier. And they start to understand the reason why, and it makes it easier to want to learn how to use it. The sixth reason why you may be struggling to understand Spanish, to really speak it, you insist on learning Spanish the way you like. Some people have certain ideas about how they want to learn Spanish. Well, I don't learn memorizing things. I don't like reading things. I don't like doing a bunch of this kind of work. I just want to hear it and absorb it the same way a baby does. Or everybody has their own way of how they would prefer to learn something. And that's totally something that a good teacher dismisses. Obviously, people do have certain ways of learning that work for them. A good teacher will adapt to that where possible. But the fact of the matter is, so many people have tried to learn Spanish using all sorts of different ways. And most likely, most of them pick the way that was just their favorite. But the vast majority of people who have attempted to learn Spanish they didn't grow up speaking it, perhaps someone from the United States, a little bit older, just trying to learn it more as an adult, the vast majority of those people don't actually achieve the goal of becoming fluent. The success rate is extremely low. And I'm not sure if people realize that, do research on that. But if this idea of just learning it however you want to learn it or your favorite way worked, more people would have success learning Spanish. And if you have a method of teaching Spanish that you feel works for you, then go ahead and do it. But if you've been trying to learn it for many, many years and you haven't gotten to that level, it just may be a sign that it may be time to humbly look for a different way of learning Spanish that may not be your favorite. It might involve a little more memorization. It may involve a little more work. But if it hasn't been working for you, what you've been doing for so long, it might be the time to try something new. The seventh reason why you may not be able to speak Spanish well, you can't slash won't pay enough or practice enough. Sometimes we just don't have enough money, and that's understandable. If we don't have the money, we can't pay a certain amount beyond our budget. But considering the fact that so many methods of teaching Spanish and so many teachers and students are failing, if somebody does have a method where they actually have reviews where their students are reaching fluency, that is rare, very rare. And if there are so many teachers and they're not actually having success, and then you're one of the few teachers who has a method that is actually getting their students fluent, well, that's worth something. And so, if we are serious about learning Spanish, we may need to consider the necessity of being willing to pay a little bit more for something that's rare and worth it. Once again, if we don't have the money, we don't have the money. But we spend money on a lot of things in life. And if those things are valuable to us and important to us, and if Spanish is valuable to us and really being able to speak it is important to us, maybe we would be willing to pay a little bit more than we thought it was worth originally. And the same idea with practicing enough. Some people do have the ability and the desire to pay a certain amount of money to learn Spanish, but then they realize in their own schedule and their own time, they simply don't have the time to practice on their own the things that they're learning. And so we may have to honestly ask ourselves this question here in the bottom of this article and the seventh point. Even if I have the money to learn Spanish, do I have the time? The eighth reason, and this has more to do with perhaps your kid or your child if you want them to learn Spanish. The eighth reason why they may not be making progress is because you let your kid make the decisions. I've seen different students, different parents who they want to have a Spanish lesson with one tutor, then another one, and at the end of just one lesson each, 1 hour each, they want the kid to make the decision about which one they liked better. Kids are very smart and mature beyond their years, but a lot of kids, do they have some sort of special knowledge about the best way of learning Spanish? Or like, what are the kids, a little kid, what are they supposed to base that decision on? Like how the person made them feel, whether they talked to them about their favorite sport, or whether they were a little mean, or they smiled, and all these things matter. Obviously, a good teacher wants to try to connect with the kid and make it fun. But at the end of the day, as we've already mentioned, many teachers don't have a teaching method that's actually working as far as students getting to fluency. When a kid, a little kid, makes a decision about who's the best Spanish teacher for him, that's probably based off of superficial things. A parent normally has more knowledge, more wisdom, able to analyze a lot of different things. Many parents who are very involved in their child's life and make the decisions for their child, especially a decision such as who's going to be their Spanish teacher, those children tend to progress a little bit better in learning Spanish. The ninth reason, you gave up too soon. The article mentions something very interesting here They fail to understand that in reality, it is both a monumental task and life-changing achievement to learn another language. Anybody who makes it seem like learning another language, learning Spanish, and that includes learning Spanish, is easy, is just not telling the truth, trying to sell something, or they just don't know what they're talking about. Learning another language is hard. It's a monumental task. That may not be something that you're able to do very quickly, learning Spanish. I've seen students who have done well. They've been progressing, but they reach certain challenging concepts. It gets a little bit difficult. And at a certain point, they just give up. They had the intelligence, they had the time, but just as it became a little too long, a little bit too difficult, they got really discouraged with themselves and they gave up. And that's everyone's right to decide, but that may be a reason why, in your case, you didn't get to the point of fluency. You may have had a good teacher, a good teaching method, but you just got so discouraged with yourself and maybe the idea of not progressing in the time period that you wanted that you gave up. And perhaps if you continued longer, you would have reached that fluency. And then the 10th reason why you still can't speak Spanish well, you want to learn Spanish for the wrong reasons. The first point here, since the task is indeed so monumental of learning Spanish, often an equally monumental desire and motivation is needed to make you equal to the task. There's all kinds of reasons why someone could learn Spanish. The ones who have had really deep, meaningful motivations behind learning Spanish, and usually that involves wanting to connect with people of a different culture for whatever reason, really wanting to have a relationship with certain people who speak a different language. Those ones are often willing to push a little longer when they do reach those difficult grammatical concepts that they're not getting, or when they do realize they've been taking classes for a little longer than they had hoped. They have that real desire of a relationship, perhaps with some other person, some other group of people, and that pushes them a little bit more than those who have a desire to just impress somebody else or get a good grade on a test. We all have different reasons. If your reason is just to get a good grade on a test or even something superficial, you can still learn Spanish fluently. A lot of people do that. But the ones that have a really strong motivating factor tend to push a little bit longer if indeed those difficult, discouraging times during the course of learning Spanish do come. So there you have it. 10 reasons that many never get to that next level of speaking Spanish. And if you avoid these 10 reasons, you probably will have a good shot of reaching your goal to be fluent in Spanish.